From 1910 to 1945, the Japanese Empire deprived our sovereignty through embassy war and illegal colonization. It made compulsory mobilization of around 800,000 Koreans into Japan. In 1945, the United States dropped 8 bombs in Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The number of Koreans who suffered from the bombing is estimated to be around 70,000 to 100,000, while numbers of deaths amounted to about 50,000. A considerable number of the victims were drafted workers through forced mobilization by the Japanese Empire. Although around 43,000 A-bomb survivors returned to their liberated homeland, they faced nothing but neglect from the South Korean government and poverty and social mistreatment resulting from the aftermath of the bombings. Suffering threefold from Japan's compulsory mobilization, the USA bombings, and the South Korean government's neglect, Korean A-bomb victims gained consciousness of their need for reparations through the conclusion of the 1965 treaty between Japan and the Republic of Korea. To make their voices heard, they founded the Association of Korean A-bomb Victims on February 11, 1967. On November 4, 1967, around 20 A-bomb victims carried out a protest with a banner that read, "Reparations of my body," in front of the Japanese embassy. Son Gi-dal, who suffered the bombing when she was forcibly mobilized into Mitsubishi shipyard, illegally entered Japan to demand medical treatment for Korean A-bomb victims for the first time. However, Japan refused her request. In December 1968, Im Bok-sun from Seoul and Nam Bun-yeon from Busan received treatment in Hiroshima's A-bomb specialized hospital thanks to Hiraoka Takashi, a reporter from Jukoku newspaper. After treatment, they applied for the issue of A-bomb victims' medical notebook as the first victims residing in Korea, but Japan refused their request. On April 10, 1970, there was an effort to build a memorial tower for the Korean A-bomb victims inside the Hiroshima Peace Memorial Park, proposed by Yoon Byung-do, a Korean A-bomb victim residing in Hiroshima, and fundraised by Koreans living in Japan. This effort, however, was obstructed by Japan and precipitated the unveiling ceremony to be held outside the Peace Memorial Park. From 1970 to 1978, Son Jin-do from Busan, a Korean victim who secretly entered Japan for treatment, was issued an A-bomb victims medical notebook after 80 years of President's lawsuit, opening the way for the Korean A-bomb victims to be supported. On July 1, 1971, upon the Japanese Prime Minister Sato's visit to Korea, around 10 Korean A-bomb victims went to the Japanese embassy to deliver a letter in which they demanded Japan to take measures for medical facilities, living, and their children's education, and were forcibly arrested. On August 6, 1971, 10 or so Korean victims cried out, "The U.S. government should also reparate Korean A-bomb victims," in front of the United States Embassy in Seoul. On March 6, 1975, Lee Nam-soo, victim of the A-bombing after the compulsory draft in 1942, passed away, leaving final words, "After I die, leave my coffin to the Japanese embassy, and don't do any funeral service unless we receive reparations from Japan." On February 8, 1988, Shin Young-soo, president of the Korean A-bomb Victims Association, and 4 victims met with Yanai Shinichi, a Japanese ambassador, and delivered a letter of demand on $2.3 billion for the medical expenses for around 25,000 surviving Korean A-bomb victims. On March 22, 1990, around 300 victims gathered at the National Assembly and held a determination rally demanding apology and reparations from Japan. On June 11, 1990, Imeng-hee, a A-bomb victim, attempted suicide by taking poison in front of the Japanese embassy. Compelled by this incident, Kim Il-sung publicly disclosed on August 14, 1991, that she was an enforced comfort woman for the Japanese military, publicizing the issue of comfort women to the world. On July 23, 1994, just before the South Korea-Japan Summit meeting, 113 South Korean atomic bomb victims held a rally at the Japanese embassy, pressuring Japan for reparations. In December of 1994, Japan enacted the Bill of Relief on the Protection of Japanese A-bomb victims, which limited supported subjects to the residents of Japan, excluding and discriminating A-bomb victims residing in Korea.
미국주의 침략 전쟁에 의해 지금 이 시간까지도 그 광기의 역사가 한국 원법 이상 환우들의 몸과 마음을 관통하고 있는 현실을 인식해야 한다고 생각합니다.
On March 22, 2002, Kim Young-il, a second-generation A-bomb patient, held a press conference with his father Kim Bong-dae in Daegu and informed the world on the medical issues of the second-generation A-bomb patients. He organized the Association of the Second-Generation Patients of Korean Atomic Bomb Victims, starting a campaign on an enactment of Special Bill of Relief which will support generations affected by the bombings. In 2003, Kwak Ki-eun, an A-bomb victim, started the so-called Kwak Ki-eun trial and won, which opened a path for Korean A-bomb victims to be applied of and supported by the Japanese Bill of Relief. On October 19, 2005, victims occupied the office of the National Human Rights Committee, infuriated by the dealings of the Korean government who thoroughly neglected to support A-bomb victims. They had 13 days of a sit-in protest demanding enactment of the special law on the support of A-bomb victims, research on the actual conditions of victims and preparation of support measure, and renegotiation on the Korean-Japanese agreement. On September 20, 2011, Korean A-bomb victims held a press conference at the Japanese embassy, demanding its immediate annulment and renegotiation of the South Korea-Japan agreement on the right to claim damages, as well as for the Japanese government's apology and reparations. On May 24, 2012, South Korea's Supreme Court ruled the Japanese Empire's colonial domination and compulsory mobilization as illegal. On August 12, 2013, victims demanded the South Korean government to raise the damage lawsuits and receive Japan's apology and reparations for the A-bomb victims. On April 27, 2015, Solidarity for Peace and Reunification of Korea, also known as SPARC, and People's Solidarity for Participatory Democracy, also known as PSPD, visited the U.S. Department of State and demanded its acknowledgement of the existence of Korean A-bomb victims and act on the investigation and reparations for victims, but the U.S. refused recognition.
우리나라는 미국이 넣기 전에 하루라도 속히 피해자에 대한 사죄를 요구합니다.
On May 1, 2015, victims Kim Jin-tae and Kim Bong-dae raised the issue of Korean A-bomb victims for the first time at the UN and inquired the accountability for the original sin of the United States that conducted the bombings.
한국인 엄포 피해자 특별법을 제정하라!
On September 8, 2015, people held a rally at the National Assembly to demand the enactment of special laws on the support of A-bomb victims. They appealed for the US and Japan to apologize to South Korean A-bomb victims. On May 26, 2016, President Obama, visiting Japan, acknowledged the existence of Korean A-bomb victims for the first time as the President of the United States, referring to thousands of Koreans among the victims of the USA bombing. Upon Obama's visit to Japan, Korean A-bomb victims and SPARC traveled to Hiroshima together and demanded acknowledgement of Korean A-bomb victims, calling for reparations. On May 29, 2016, a special law on the support of A-bomb victims was enacted in the National Assembly 71 years after the A bombings. Despite the enactment, the law contained nothing on the support of second-generation and other descendant victims of A bombings. On October 27, 2018, people held a general meeting in creation of the Association for the Descendants of Korean A-bomb Victims through the integration of the Association of Second-Generation Patients from A-bombings and the Association of Second Generation of the A-bomb Victims for public acknowledgement that the second and the third generation descendants were also A-bomb victims. On February 21st, 2019, upon the 100th anniversary of March 1st Independence Movement, people held a press conference at the Presidential House demanding President Moon Jae-in's visit to Hapcheon in support of second and third generation victims by amending the Special Bill of Relief for supporting A-bomb victims. With the agreement on the recording of oral statement on April 25, 2019, use of Spark started on recording of oral statements on Korean A-bomb victims. They also drove for the enactment of regulation for the support in broader regions and special cities, which do not have regulation on the support of victims. On June 28, 2019, upon the United States President Trump's visit to South Korea, about 250 victims held a press conference and marched around the U.S. Embassy, inquiring the responsibility of the United States that orchestrated bombings and demanded for its apology and reparations. On November 25, 2019, Korean A-bomb victims joined the mass officiated by Pope Francis, who visited atomic bomb sites in Japan, publicly showing the existence of Korean A-bomb victims and their aspiration for non-nuclearization of Korean Peninsula and realization of nuclear-free world. They also pushed for international concern and participation for countries to join the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons Treaty. 2020 is the 75th year after the A-bombings. Justice and human rights to the A-bomb victims. We demand investigation, apology, and reparation for the Korean A-bomb victims.